Lucille O'Neill stepped into the Grand Hotel, expecting luxury, but was met with humiliation. Victoria Lennox, the receptionist, took one look at her and made a decision. No reservation, no respect, just dismissal. What she didn't know? Lucille wasn't alone in this story. Because Shaquille O'Neal, NBA legend, businessman, and a son who never lets disrespect slide, was just minutes away. And when he walks in, the entire hotel will never be the same. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The city pulsed with energy as the sun glinted off the glass towers of downtown. The streets hummed with the sound of honking cabs, the distant chatter of tourists, and the occasional screech of sneakers on pavement. It was a city that never slept, a place where wealth and power intertwined seamlessly with everyday life. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq to the world, stepped off a private jet, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit that complemented his towering presence. He wasn't just a basketball legend. He was a businessman, a philanthropist, and most importantly, a devoted son. This wasn't just another trip. It was personal. Shaq had come to town for an exclusive gala honoring his contributions to sports and society. But amid the flashing cameras and media frenzy, there was only one thing on his mind. His mother, Lucille O'Neill. She was his rock, the woman who had shaped him, guided him, and stood by him long before the world knew his name. This weekend wasn't just about the event. It was about making her feel special, reminding her that no matter how big he became, she would always be his priority. He had gone the extra mile, reserving the most luxurious suite in one of the city's most prestigious hotels, the kind of place where celebrities, CEOs, and politicians crossed paths in hushed conversations over champagne, a place where status was everything. He wanted Lucille to experience that, to enjoy the best life had to offer. As his sleek black SUV pulled up to the hotel entrance, he glanced at his phone. A simple message from Lucille. "Just landed, baby." Excited. A smile crept across his face. She had no idea what was waiting for her. Across town, Lucille O'Neill stepped out of a car, her eyes widening at the sight before her. The hotel was a towering masterpiece of modern architecture, its pristine white columns stretching toward the sky. A red carpet led to the grand entrance, where doormen in crisp uniforms stood like sentinels, opening doors for arriving guests. Lucille smoothed down her elegant cream-colored dress, adjusting the pearl necklace Shaq had gifted her years ago. She had always taught her son the value of humility, of treating everyone with kindness regardless of status. But today, as she walked toward the entrance of this grand establishment, she allowed herself a small moment of pride. Her son had made it. He had built a life where he could give her this moment, this experience. Inside, the lobby was a scene of controlled opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft golden glow over the marble floors, and the scent of fresh lilies filled the air. High-profile guests moved effortlessly through the space, their conversations hushed, their designer luggage wheeled silently by attentive staff. Lucille stepped up to the reception desk, her heart warm with anticipation. The surprise was unfolding exactly as Shaq had planned. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Welcome to the Regal Crown Hotel. How may I assist you?" The receptionist, a slender woman with sharp features and an even sharper gaze, barely looked up from her screen. Lucille smiled graciously. "Yes, my son booked a suite for me. O'Neill, Lucille O'Neill." For a moment, there was no response. Then, the receptionist's eyes flicked up, scanning Lucille with an unreadable expression. Her gaze lingered, not with the warmth of hospitality, but with something colder, more dismissive. "I'm sorry, but we don't have a reservation under that name," she said flatly. Lucille frowned, pulling out her phone. "Oh, that can't be right. My son made the arrangements. He told me everything was set." The receptionist sighed, tapping away at her keyboard with exaggerated effort. "Ma'am, we have no record of an O'Neill suite booking. Are you sure you're at the right hotel?" Her voice had a condescending edge, the kind reserved for people who, in her eyes, didn't belong. Lucille's fingers tightened around her phone. She wasn't naive. She had lived through decades where moments like this weren't rare, they were expected. The subtle shift in tone, The way people's eyes evaluated you before deciding how much respect to afford. It was something you never forgot. She took a slow breath, willing herself to stay composed. I'm sure. My son is Shaquille O'Neal. He booked it personally. The moment the name left her lips, a flicker of something crossed the receptionist's face. Recognition, hesitation. But it vanished as quickly as it came. Instead, she forced a tight smile. Right. Well, unfortunately, I don't see that here. Maybe he made a mistake. Lucille knew better. Shaq didn't make mistakes when it came to her. She glanced around, noticing the way a few guests had started to pay attention. A well-dressed couple whispered nearby, stealing glances in her direction. An older gentleman sitting in one of the plush lounge chairs lowered his newspaper slightly, watching. The tension in the air shifted, subtle but undeniable. A young bellboy standing a few feet away hesitated, his eyes darting between Lucille and the receptionist. He looked as though he wanted to step in, to say something, but the invisible rules of hierarchy held him back. Lucille turned back to the receptionist, her voice steady but firm. I'd like to speak to the manager. The woman's smile thinned. I'm not sure the manager is available right now. Lucille inhaled slowly, keeping her patience intact. Then I suggest you find them, because my son wouldn't put me in a situation like this. The receptionist stared at her for a long moment, then exhaled sharply. Fine, wait here. With that, she turned and disappeared into the back office. Lucille stood in the middle of the grand lobby, her presence both powerful and vulnerable. Eyes continued to linger, some curious, some judgmental. She glanced down at her phone, her thumb hovering over Shaq's number. She didn't want to call him over something like this. He had always been protective, and she knew if he walked into this situation, there would be no ignoring it. But as minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, something inside her shifted. It wasn't about the suite anymore. It was about dignity. She pressed the call button. Shaq was still in his car when his phone vibrated. Seeing his mother's name on the screen, he answered immediately. Hey, Mama, you like the surprise? He asked, grinning. There was a pause. Then, in a measured voice, Lucille said, Baby, I'm at the hotel. But we have a little situation here. Shaq's expression darkened instantly. What kind of situation? Lucille hesitated, not wanting to make a scene. They're saying they don't have my reservation. Silence. Then, in a voice calmer than it had any right to be, Shaq asked, Who's saying that? Lucille sighed. The receptionist. She doesn't seem too interested in checking properly. Shaq didn't need to hear more. He had been in enough rooms, enough situations, to recognize what was happening. His grip tightened around his phone. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Lucille started to protest. Baby, I don't want you to. I said I'll be there in 10. His voice was low, steady. When Shaquille O'Neal walked into a room, people noticed. In 10 minutes, that receptionist was about to find out exactly who she had just dismissed. And this time, the whole world would be watching. Lucille O'Neal stood at the grand reception desk, her fingers resting lightly on the polished marble counter. The receptionist, a tall woman with an icy demeanor, tapped away at her keyboard, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the keys in an exaggerated rhythm. The name on her tag read, Victoria Lennox. Everything about her, her sharp gaze, her stiff posture, the way her lips curled ever so slightly in disapproval, screamed exclusivity. Not the welcoming kind, but the kind that silently measured people, deciding who deserved attention and who didn't. Lucille noticed the way Victoria's eyes skimmed her outfit, her gaze lingering on the modest pearls around her neck, the neatly pressed cream-colored dress. There was nothing loud or ostentatious about her, yet the silent evaluation was clear. You don't belong here. I told you, ma'am. There's no reservation under the name Lucille O'Neal, Victoria repeated, her voice tinged with forced patience, as if speaking to someone who simply didn't understand how things worked. Lucille met her gaze evenly. My son, Shaquille O'Neal, made the reservation. He told me everything was set. Victoria's brows lifted slightly, but not in recognition, more in disbelief. Your son? Lucille nodded. Yes, My son. For the briefest moment, Victoria hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. Then, just as quickly, her expression hardened again. I'm sorry, but we don't have that name in our system. Perhaps you're at the wrong hotel. Lucille let out a measured breath, keeping her composure. This is the Regal Crown, isn't it? Of course. Then I'm in the right place. There was a pause, and the air between them grew heavier. The quiet hum of luxury surrounded them. The soft clink of champagne glasses, the murmur of guests checking in, the polite laughter of a well-dressed couple seated in the lobby. Yet, at this desk, all of that melted into something else entirely. A silent standoff. Lucille could feel the weight of the moment shifting. She knew this feeling well. The way people sized her up before deciding how much respect to offer. She had lived through it before, in grocery stores, in department stores, in places where silent judgment held more weight than words. Victoria exhaled sharply and shook her head. We don't take walk-ins for suites, ma'am. This is a 5-star establishment. If you'd like, I can direct you to a more suitable hotel nearby. The words weren't loud, but they carried through the air like a slap. A nearby couple paused mid-conversation. A concierge standing near the luggage carts glanced over. The young bellboy, who had been watching quietly from the side, stiffened slightly. Lucille straightened, her heartbeat steady but her patience thinning. I'm not a walk-in. I have a reservation. I suggest you check again. Victoria sighed dramatically, tapping the keyboard again, though it was clear she wasn't actually looking. A long, exasperated pause followed. Then, she smiled, a thin, forced thing meant to close the conversation rather than continue it. Still nothing. I'm afraid there's nothing more I can do. Lucille inhaled slowly. Then let me speak to the manager. Victoria's expression flickered, but only for a second. The manager is very busy at the moment. Lucille nodded, her voice calm but firm. I'll wait. A tense silence settled. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. There was no reason to refuse this request, yet she hesitated, her grip tightening slightly on the desk's edge. Lucille saw it, the reluctance, the subtle resistance. And then, in a move so swift it could have been missed, Victoria's eyes flicked toward the security desk. Lucille followed the glance and saw them. 2 uniformed security personnel standing near the entrance, their posture relaxed but their eyes alert. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head, nodded slightly in acknowledgement as Victoria gave him a barely perceptible signal. The realization settled over Lucille like a slow wave. She's calling security. For me. She took a steady breath, willing herself not to react, not yet. Instead, she held her ground, lifting her chin slightly. Did you just signal for security? She asked, her voice controlled but laced with quiet authority. Victoria blinked, her expression a mask of innocence. Of course not. I was just ensuring everything is in order. Lucille's gaze didn't waver. That's interesting, because I haven't raised my voice. I haven't caused a scene. And yet somehow, you think I need to be handled. The words landed like a small but deliberate earthquake. Nearby, the bellboy shifted uncomfortably, casting a nervous glance at Victoria. A woman seated in the lounge area slowly set down her coffee, her gaze now fully on the unfolding interaction. Victoria's smile stayed in place, but her eyes flashed with something colder. I'm simply following protocol, ma'am. Protocol? Lucille let the words settle between them. Tell me, what part of protocol involves dismissing a guest before properly checking their reservation? Another charged silence. Victoria opened her mouth, but before she could respond, a deep voice cut through the tension. Excuse me, is there a problem here? The hotel's assistant manager had approached. A younger man in his mid-30s, his polished name tag reading Daniel Foster. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, but there was something in his posture, something uncertain. He had clearly noticed the tension from across the room and had decided to intervene. Victoria turned to him, her expression shifting into something more composed. Oh, no problem at all, Daniel. This guest was just confused about her reservation. It seems there was a misunderstanding. Lucille's eyes narrowed slightly. Misunderstanding, a convenient word. Daniel glanced at Lucille, taking in her composed but firm stance, the way her fingers rested deliberately on her phone screen. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't angry. She was simply waiting. He hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Ma'am, may I ask the name on the reservation?" Lucille met his gaze directly. Lucille O'Neill. The name hit like a slow-moving realization. Daniel's brow furrowed, then lifted slightly. "O'Neill, as in..." "Shaquille O'Neal," Lucille finished, watching him carefully. "My son." For the first time, real recognition dawned. Daniel's posture shifted, stiffening slightly, as if an invisible weight had just landed on his shoulders. He turned to Victoria, a subtle frown creasing his forehead. "Victoria, did you check properly?" Victoria hesitated, but the damage was already done. The shift in Daniel's demeanor told her everything. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening before turning back to Lucille. "Ma'am, please excuse any misunderstanding. Let me personally check this for you." Lucille didn't move. "I'd appreciate that." Daniel motioned to the computer, and as he began typing, Victoria took a half step back, her fingers curling into her palm. The lobby was now completely silent. Conversations had paused, and all eyes were subtly, or not so subtly, on them. The moment was teetering on an edge. Lucille didn't have to look to know her phone was vibrating. She already knew who it was. Shaq had arrived, and the moment he walked through those doors, everything would change. The grand lobby of the Regal Crown Hotel had fallen into an uneasy hush. The luxurious ambiance, the distant clinking of glasses, the soft notes of a piano from the lounge, the low murmurs of hushed conversations, now felt forced, like a carefully curated illusion on the verge of cracking. Lucille O'Neill stood at the reception desk, her expression composed, yet unmistakably wounded. Across from her, the receptionist, Victoria Lennox, maintained a polite but icy smile, her posture rigid with unspoken authority. It was a standoff that no one dared interrupt, though the tension in the air was palpable. All around them, silent witnesses watched. Near the entrance, a group of well-dressed guests stood frozen in an awkward moment between checking in and deciding whether to step forward. A middle-aged man in a tailored gray suit cast a quick glance toward the reception desk before looking away, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeves as if the confrontation didn't concern him. Beside him, a woman in a sleek black dress whispered something to her husband, her brows furrowed in unease. Further back, a concierge in a pristine white uniform shifted uncomfortably. He had been trained to provide seamless service, to ensure every guest felt valued, yet he knew better than to involve himself in a matter that, to some, still carried invisible barriers. And then there was him, the bellboy. A young man, barely in his 20s, stood near the luggage carts, gripping the handle of a designer suitcase a little too tightly. His name tag read, Nathan Carter. Unlike the others, he wasn't looking away. His jaw tightened as he watched Victoria dismiss Lucille with the same effortless arrogance he had seen too many times before. Nathan had worked at the hotel long enough to recognize the signs, the subtle shift in tone, the condescending patience, the way security had been signaled before Lucille had done anything at all. But what could he do? His eyes flicked to Daniel Foster, the assistant manager. Daniel was watching too, his brows drawn together in hesitation. He had intervened, but not forcefully. He had questioned Victoria, but he hadn't contradicted her. He had stepped in, yet he remained careful. Because even for him, a manager, there were unspoken rules. Victoria sighed theatrically and shook her head. "Mrs. O'Neill, I assure you, I've checked thoroughly. There is no reservation. Now, I understand that misunderstandings happen, but unfortunately, we are fully booked for the weekend. Perhaps there's another hotel that might better suit your needs." The words landed with a cruel precision, wrapped in feigned professionalism. Another hotel. A more suitable place. Lucille inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had endured worse in her lifetime, but that didn't mean it hurt any less. Nathan clenched his jaw. He wanted to step in, to say something. But what could he say that wouldn't cost him his job? He had seen people let go for less. He had bills to pay, a mother at home who depended on him. His silence wasn't out of indifference. It was out of fear. But fear tasted bitter when it meant watching injustice unfold. Lucille nodded, her voice soft but firm. I see. She turned away from the desk, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she stepped aside. The guests watching quickly pretended to be interested in something else. The couple in the lounge suddenly found their drinks fascinating. The man in the suit glanced down at his phone. Everyone had been watching, yet no one wanted to see. Lucille reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and pressed a familiar number. The line rang twice before she heard her son's deep voice. Hey, Mama. Lucille closed her eyes briefly, gathering herself. Baby, I need you to come here. A brief silence. Then, a quiet shift in Shaq's tone. Where are you? At the hotel, she said. But there's a situation. A pause. Not long, but heavy. Then, in a voice so steady it carried an unspoken promise, Shaq said, I'm on my way. Lucille lowered her phone, exhaling. She wasn't the kind of woman to call her son over small inconveniences. But this wasn't just about a missing reservation. This was about dignity. Nathan swallowed hard, watching her. He glanced at Victoria, whose expression remained neutral, perhaps even smug. She thought she had won. He had no idea who Lucille's son was, but he had a feeling Victoria was about to find out, and something told him she wouldn't like the answer. The glass doors of the Regal Crown Hotel glided open with a silent whoosh, and in stepped Shaquille O'Neal. The energy in the lobby shifted in an instant. Conversations paused mid-sentence. The soft tinkling of piano keys from the lounge faltered, as the musician, along with nearly everyone else in the room, turned their gaze toward the towering figure now standing at the entrance. At 7 feet, 1 inch, Shaq wasn't just a presence. He was a force. Dressed in a tailored charcoal gray suit with a crisp black shirt underneath, he exuded effortless authority. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to demand attention. It was given to him the moment he stepped into a room. His sharp eyes swept across the lobby, searching. Then he found her. Lucille stood a few feet away from the reception desk, her posture composed but unmistakably weary. She hadn't told him everything over the phone, but she didn't need to. Shaq knew his mother. He knew the look she had on her face, the quiet dignity she carried even when she had every reason to be upset. His jaw tightened. A few feet away, Victoria Lennox, who had been so confident, so dismissive just moments ago, suddenly looked as though she had swallowed glass. She knew who he was. Of course she did. Everyone did. But what she hadn't known, what she hadn't considered, was that this woman, the one she had just humiliated, was his mother. And now, there was nowhere to hide. Shaq walked forward with an unhurried pace, his polished dress shoes clicking against the marble floor. The weight of his presence seemed to press down on the entire lobby. A hush fell over the guests, their curiosity burning beneath a thin veil of politeness. Nathan, the young bellboy, took a step back, his heart pounding. He had seen celebrities before, but this was something different. This wasn't a meet and greet. This was a reckoning. Shaq reached his mother's side and placed a gentle, massive hand on her shoulder. You okay, Mama? Lucille looked up at her son and gave a small nod. I'm fine, baby. But Shaq knew better. He turned, his gaze locking onto Victoria. She straightened instinctively, her professional mask slipping for just a fraction of a second. Who's in charge here? Shaq's voice was calm, but the weight of the question was anything but. Daniel Foster, the assistant manager who had been standing stiffly nearby, quickly stepped forward. Mr. O'Neal, Shaq cut him a glance, but his expression didn't shift. I wasn't asking you. Daniel hesitated, then took a step back. The entire room seemed to shrink under the weight of the moment. Shaq turned back to Victoria, his eyes steady. I'm asking her. Victoria's throat bobbed in a nervous swallow. I manage the front desk operations, she said, her voice suddenly much quieter than it had been when speaking to Lucille. Good, Shaq said. Then explain something to me. Victoria's fingers gripped the edge of the counter. Of course, sir. How can I help you? Shaq let the silence stretch just long enough to make her squirm. Then he said, Why did my mother have to call me? Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it again. She glanced at Daniel, but he wasn't going to save her. Not now. Shaq took a slow step closer. He didn't need to loom over her. He already did. See, my mother doesn't call me over small things. She doesn't like to make a fuss, which tells me whatever happened here wasn't small. Victoria forced a tight smile. Mr. O'Neill, there must have been some sort of misunderstanding? Shaq finished for her. His voice didn't rise, but the word cut through the air like a blade. Victoria paled. Yes. Perhaps there was a mistake in the system. I was simply following procedure. Shaq studied her for a long moment. Then he turned, glancing at the guests who had been watching in silence. You hear that? He said, his voice carrying across the lobby. She was following procedure. The words hung there, daring anyone to challenge them. The guests looked away. Some shifted awkwardly. Others, the ones who had seen everything, held Shaq's gaze for just a second longer before lowering their heads, because they all knew. This wasn't procedure. This was something else entirely. Shaq turned back to Victoria. Let me ask you something. If my mother had walked in here wearing a designer dress with cameras following her, would you have treated her the same way? Victoria's lips parted, but no words came. Would you have called security? Shaq asked, his voice quieter now, but sharper. Victoria swallowed hard. Sir, I assure you I'm not looking for an assurance, Shaq interrupted. I'm looking for an answer. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's breathing had turned shallow. Daniel looked like he wanted to vanish. The bellboy Nathan held his breath. And then Shaq did something unexpected. He stepped back, took a slow, deliberate breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was calm, even. You know what the problem is? He said, shaking his head slightly. People like you think respect is something you only give to the people you think are important. Victoria blinked rapidly. Mr. O'Neill, But respect? Shaq continued, cutting her off effortlessly. Respect is about how you treat people when you don't know who they are. Victoria's face was ashen. Shaq let the silence sit for a moment longer, before finally exhaling. He turned to his mother, his expression softening. You want to stay here, Mama? Lucille looked around the room, the lingering stares, the tension thick in the air, the way Victoria looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. She sighed. No, baby. Let's go somewhere else. Shaq nodded. Good choice. Then he turned back to Victoria, his expression unreadable. I hope you have a good night, Miss Lennox. With that, Shaquille O'Neal, the man who had faced the toughest players on the court, the man who had never backed down from a challenge, turned and walked his mother out of the Regal Crown Hotel. And as they left, the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air like an unspoken warning. Because everyone knew. Victoria Lennox would never forget the day she dismissed Lucille O'Neill, and neither would anyone else. The lobby remained deathly silent, the air thick with unspoken tension. Victoria Lennox stood stiff behind the reception desk, her polished nails digging into the counter as she tried to steady her breathing. The energy in the room had shifted the moment Shaquille O'Neal walked in, but it wasn't just his size or celebrity that had altered the atmosphere. It was the way he carried himself, calm, controlled, unshaken, like a man who didn't need to raise his voice to make an impact. Shaq's eyes remained locked on Victoria, but there was no rage in them, no explosive outburst, just a quiet intensity that made her far more uncomfortable than yelling ever could. She would have preferred yelling. Yelling she could dismiss. Yelling she could argue against. But this silence was suffocating. Shaq took a slow step forward, his hands tucked into his pockets, his deep voice finally breaking the stillness. Let me ask you something, Miss Lennox, he said, his tone even. How long you been working here? Victoria blinked, caught off guard. I've been at the Regal Crown for 8 years. 8 years, Shaq repeated, nodding. That's a long time. Means you must know this place pretty well, huh? Of course, sir, she replied, forcing a small smile. I take pride in my work. Shaq tilted his head slightly, considering her. That so? Victoria straightened. Absolutely. Shaq let a beat of silence pass before speaking again. Then tell me something. What's the first rule of hospitality? Victoria's lips parted, but no words came. She glanced at Daniel Foster, the assistant manager, who had remained frozen nearby. His silence was no longer cautious. It was now calculated. He was waiting, watching how she would answer. "The first rule?" Victoria finally said, stalling. "Yeah," Shaq nodded. "The first rule. The one they teach you on day one." "What is it?" Victoria swallowed. "Well, customer service, of course. Making sure guests have an excellent experience." "Guests," Shaq interrupted. "All guests?" Victoria hesitated. "Yes." Shaq let out a small, humorless chuckle. "That's funny. Because when this guest—" He motioned toward his mother, his voice never rising, never breaking that deadly calm. "My mother walked in here. You didn't seem too interested in customer service." Victoria's face paled. "Mr. O'Neill, See, here's what I don't get." Shaq continued smoothly. "My mama walks in here, respectful, patient, doesn't make a scene. She tells you she has a reservation. And you?" He spread his hands, as if genuinely curious. "You look her up and down like she don't belong. You dismiss her. And then, before she even gets upset, you call security." Victoria's breath hitched slightly. "You ever call security on someone like me?" Shaq asked, tilting his head. Victoria stiffened. "Sir, You ever called security on a man in a $5,000 suit? A woman dripping in designer jewelry?" Shaq's voice was low, but pointed. "Or is it just the ones who don't fit your idea of what luxury looks like?" Victoria opened her mouth, then shut it again. Shaq gave her time to respond, but she had none. And that silence, the one that stretched between them, said more than any excuse ever could. From the corner of the room, Daniel Foster finally moved. He cleared his throat and stepped forward, his face tight with barely concealed concern. Not concern for Victoria, but concern for the hotel. Concern for the PR disaster that was unfolding in real time. "Mr. O'Neill," Daniel began, forcing a polite smile. "I assure you the Regal Crown holds itself to the highest standards of hospitality. If there was any misunderstanding, I sincerely apologize." Shaq cut him a look. "Misunderstanding is a real interesting word, Daniel. Y'all use that a lot when things don't go the way you planned." Daniel faltered. I only meant that because from where I'm standing," Shaq continued, "ain't much to misunderstand. My mother got humiliated, not because of a technical issue, not because of a mistake in the system, but because somebody looked at her and decided, she don't belong here." Daniel's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Across the room, a few guests shifted uncomfortably. They had witnessed what happened, and now they were hearing it laid out with no way to deny it. Nathan, the young bellboy, swallowed hard, his hands clenched at his sides. He had never seen someone so powerful handle a situation this way. Shaq hadn't thrown threats. He hadn't raised his voice, but he had exposed everything. And now? Now Victoria knew that she was no longer in control. Shaq turned back to Victoria, watching her squirm under the weight of the moment. "So, tell me," he said, his voice calm but unyielding, "what you think should happen next." Victoria inhaled sharply. "Sir, You think you should keep your job?" Shaq asked, genuinely curious. Victoria's lips parted, panic flickering behind her eyes. Daniel jumped in before she could answer. "Mr. O'Neill, I want to personally apologize on behalf of the hotel. This is not how we treat our guests, and I can assure you, we will be handling this situation appropriately." Shaq gave a small nod. "Handling it, huh?" Daniel hesitated. "Yes, sir." Shaq exhaled. "All right, Daniel. I'll make it easy for you. Here's what's going to happen." Daniel straightened, readying himself. Shaq turned to Victoria. "You gonna take some time to think about why you did what you did, about who you assumed my mother was, about the kind of respect you give to people who don't look like you." Victoria's throat bobbed, her breath uneven. "And you?" Shaq said, turning back to Daniel. "Gonna make sure your whole staff gets trained properly. 'Cause see, I could raise hell. I could call out this hotel to millions of people in one click." He pulled out his phone, tapping it once. "But I'd rather see real change than a bunch of people scrambling to save face." Daniel nodded quickly. Absolutely, Mr. O'Neill. I'll personally ensure. Shaq held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Nah, don't just say it 'cause I'm here. Do it 'cause it's right. Daniel swallowed. Yes, sir. Shaq held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned back to his mother. His expression softened. You ready, Mama? Lucille, who had remained poised through it all, gave her son a small, proud smile. I'm ready, baby. Shaq nodded, then turned to the room, to everyone who had been watching, but not speaking. His gaze swept over the guests, the staff, the silent witnesses. And then, without another word, he placed a hand on his mother's back and walked her toward the exit. The glass doors slid open, and as they stepped into the crisp evening air, the weight of the moment settled on everyone left behind. Inside, Victoria stood frozen. Daniel wiped a nervous hand down his face. And Nathan? Nathan let out a slow breath, a hint of something resembling hope flickering in his chest. Because tonight, for once, the right person had won. As Shaquille O'Neal turned to leave, the tension in the lobby remained thick, suffocating. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. Victoria Lennox, the once composed receptionist, stood frozen, her knuckles white against the polished marble counter. The weight of her actions had finally settled on her shoulders, and for the first time since the confrontation began, real fear flickered in her eyes. Then, from across the room, a voice cut through the silence. I wouldn't leave just yet, Shaq. Heads turned as a tall, distinguished man stepped forward. Dressed in a crisp navy blue suit with an unmistakable air of authority, he walked toward the reception desk with an effortless confidence that rivaled Shaq's own. He wasn't just another guest. He was someone important, the kind of person who carried influence not with volume, but with presence. Victoria's breath hitched the moment she recognized him. No. The man stopped beside Shaq, offering a knowing smile. You always had a way of walking away right before things get interesting, my friend. Shaq's brows lifted slightly before a grin tugged at the corner of his lips. Jonathan Sterling, he said, extending a hand. Didn't know you were in town. Jonathan Sterling, a billionaire real estate investor, philanthropist, and a longtime friend of Shaq. A man whose name carried weight in every high-profile business circle, and, most importantly, the owner of multiple five-star hotels across the country. Jonathan shook Shaq's hand firmly before turning to Daniel Foster, the assistant manager who now looked as though he was wishing for a fire alarm to go off and end this nightmare. Daniel, Jonathan said smoothly, imagine my surprise when I check into one of my favorite hotels, only to witness one of the worst displays of customer service I've ever seen. Daniel swallowed hard. Mr. Sterling, I assure you, this was an isolated incident. We at the Regal Crown. Jonathan held up a hand, silencing him effortlessly. Spare me the corporate speech, Daniel. I've been in this business too long to fall for rehearsed damage control. He turned his gaze to Victoria, who suddenly found herself shrinking under his scrutiny. You, he said, his voice even but piercing. What's your name? Victoria hesitated before forcing out. Victoria Lennox, sir. Jonathan tilted his head. Lennox. That sounds familiar. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. I've been with the hotel for 8 years. Jonathan hummed as if piecing something together. That's right, 8 years. He turned slightly, glancing toward Daniel. Tell me, Daniel, has Miss Lennox always been selective with the guests she deems worthy of respect? Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. And that second? That was all the answer Jonathan needed. A murmur rippled through the room. The guests, the silent witnesses, the staff, they all saw it. Victoria's carefully constructed mask cracked. Sir, I was just following standard protocol. Jonathan arched a brow. Were you? Victoria nodded quickly, seizing the lifeline. Absolutely. I didn't recognize Mrs. O'Neill's name in the system, and as a precaution, I followed procedure to ensure... To ensure what, exactly? Jonathan interjected, his voice still eerily calm. That a polite, well-dressed woman standing at the front desk of a hotel, one she had a confirmed reservation for, was a threat. Victoria's throat bobbed. I never said she was a threat. But you treated her like one. Victoria flinched. I was just... Jonathan sighed and turned back to Daniel. Tell me something, Daniel. How many complaints has this hotel received about Miss Lennox? Daniel visibly stiffened. His gaze darted to Victoria, then back to Jonathan. I don't have that information on hand, sir. Jonathan smirked. Don't you? Daniel hesitated. Then, under the weight of the moment, he exhaled in quiet defeat. There have been... a few. Victoria snapped her head toward him. Daniel? But Daniel wouldn't look at her. Jonathan's gaze sharpened. A few? Daniel hesitated again before muttering. Several. A collective inhale spread through the crowd. Victoria's composure shattered. That's not fair, she blurted. I have always upheld the highest standard of professionalism. If people felt slighted, that's their perception, not my intent. Shaq, who had remained quiet, finally turned back to her. Perception is a dangerous word, he said, his voice low. Because you know what perception really is? It's the feeling people get when they walk away from you. Victoria opened her mouth, but Shaq wasn't done. You ever wonder why it's always certain people who walk away feeling disrespected? Silence. Shaq took a slow step forward, his towering frame making Victoria seem even smaller. But his voice remained steady, even, almost gentle. You judged my mother before she even said a word, he said. You didn't see Lucille O'Neill. You saw a woman you thought wasn't worth your time. And now you're standing here, trying to convince yourself it was all just a misunderstanding. Victoria's breaths were uneven. I didn't mean... But intentions don't matter, Shaq interrupted softly. What matters is how you make people feel. And tonight, you made my mother feel small in a place where she was supposed to feel welcomed. Victoria's eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall. Shaq exhaled. Look, I'm not here to ruin your career. I don't need to see you lose your job. But you need to understand something. Real respect doesn't have a dress code. It doesn't have a skin color. And it sure as hell shouldn't be reserved for the people you think can afford it. Victoria's lip trembled, but she nodded. Jonathan, who had been watching intently, finally spoke. I think we've seen enough. Daniel nodded quickly. I'll personally ensure that... Let me stop you there, Jonathan said smoothly. Because this isn't just about one employee. This is about a culture. His gaze swept across the staff. Every person who stood by and watched this happen, every person who saw something wrong and said nothing, you're just as much a part of the problem. A deep silence settled over the room. Jonathan turned back to Shaq and smiled slightly. You've always been the bigger man, my friend. Shaq chuckled. I try. Jonathan nodded before addressing the room one last time. Consider this a wake-up call, a lesson in humility. His gaze flicked to Victoria. I hope you've learned something tonight, Miss Lennox. Victoria swallowed hard and nodded. Shaq turned to his mother. Mama, let's get out of here. Lucille, ever graceful, offered Jonathan a warm smile before linking her arm through her son's. Lead the way, baby. As they walked out, the weight of what had just happened settled over everyone left behind. Victoria didn't move. Daniel rubbed his temples. The silent witnesses remained silent. And Jonathan? He simply smiled to himself before turning toward the bar. Now, he muttered, I could use a drink. The tension in the lobby refused to fade. Even as Shaquille O'Neal and his mother stood near the entrance, their presence still commanded the attention of everyone in the room. The weight of what had just transpired lingered, thick and unspoken. Victoria Lennox stood motionless behind the reception desk, her face pale, her hands gripping the counter as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. Moments ago, she had been the one in control, dictating who was worthy of service. Now, she was the one being judged. The silent witnesses, guests, staff, even her own manager, had turned their eyes on her. And Shaq? He could see it, the fear, the shame, the growing realization that she had miscalculated in the worst way possible. It would be so easy to demand her firing. With a single word, he could ensure she never worked in hospitality again. One tweet, and her name would be dragged across the internet, labeled forever. But Shaq had never been that kind of man. He took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch before finally speaking. His deep voice, steady and measured, carried across the room. "I ain't here to take nobody's job." The statement landed like a shockwave. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Even Victoria looked up, eyes wide with disbelief. Daniel Foster, the assistant manager, stiffened. "Mr. O'Neill, Shaq lifted a hand, silencing him effortlessly. "Firing her? That'd be too easy. It don't fix the problem. Just makes it disappear for a little while." His gaze flicked back to Victoria, pinning her in place. "You think if you lose this job, that's the end of it? You'll move on, find another front desk somewhere else, and start fresh. But what happens when the next person who don't fit your idea of belonging walks in?" Victoria swallowed, but she said nothing. Shaq nodded. "Exactly." Lucille, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but firm. "I didn't come here looking for trouble. I came here excited to stay in a place my son picked out for me. And instead, I was made to feel like I didn't deserve to be here." She shook her head, sadness flickering in her eyes. "You don't just take someone's dignity like that and walk away unchanged." Shaq turned back to Daniel. "She don't need to lose her job. She needs to learn." Daniel hesitated. "Learn?" Shaq nodded. "I want her in sensitivity training. I want every single person on this staff trained on how to treat people like people. And I don't mean some lazy corporate seminar where y'all sit in a room for an hour pretending to take notes. I mean real training. The kind that makes people take a hard look at themselves." The room fell silent. No one had expected this. Daniel exhaled slowly, glancing at Victoria. "Miss Lennox," he said carefully, "do you understand what's being offered here?" Victoria clenched her jaw. The weight of humiliation burned deep, and Shaq could see it. This wasn't just about the training. This was about pride. She had spent years operating with the quiet belief that she was the authority, that she was the gatekeeper of this hotel's luxury, deciding who did and didn't belong. And now, she was being given a choice: face her flaws or walk away in disgrace. Her pride told her to leave, but her fear told her she couldn't afford to. After what felt like an eternity, she forced out a whisper. "I understand." Shaq studied her for a moment before giving a small nod. "Good." But Daniel wasn't finished. He squared his shoulders, stepping into his own authority. "And understand this, Miss Lennox. This isn't optional." His voice was sharp now, decisive. "You will complete the training, and if I hear of one more complaint like this, you won't just lose your job. You'll never work in hospitality again. Do I make myself clear?" Victoria flinched. Her face burned red, but she nodded. "Yes, sir." Daniel exhaled, then turned back to Shaq. "Mr. O'Neill, on behalf of the Regal Crown, I sincerely apologize for everything that happened tonight. I will personally oversee these changes." Shaq studied him, then nodded. "I'll hold you to that." Daniel swallowed. He knew that wasn't just a figure of speech. Shaq could hold him to it. Shaq turned back to Victoria one last time. She had barely moved, her entire body rigid. He could see the storm of emotions behind her eyes: anger, humiliation, shame. But he also saw something else. A crack in the wall. A chance to change. He leaned in slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You got a choice now," he said. "You can walk out of here bitter, act like you were the victim, or you can take this lesson, let it change you. Up to you." Victoria's breath hitched, but she didn't answer. Shaq gave her a small nod, then finally turned to his mother. "Come on, Mama. Let's go find a place where they actually want you there." Lucille smiled. "That sounds nice, baby." And with that, Shaquille O'Neal, NBA legend, businessman, and a son who would never let his mother be disrespected, walked her out of the Regal Crown Hotel. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them. Inside, the lobby remained eerily silent. The guests, the staff, the silent witnesses, they all knew they had just watched something important. Victoria slowly sank into her chair behind the desk. She felt exposed, raw. Every assumption she had made about power and privilege had just been shattered by the very man she had tried to diminish. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her name tag, running a thumb over the engraved letters. Victoria Lennox, front desk manager. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure she deserved the title. She exhaled, staring down at her reflection in the polished marble counter. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the ending. Maybe it was the beginning. The hush in the lobby remained, heavy with everything that had just unfolded. Eyes followed Shaq and Lucille as they neared the grand entrance, but no one spoke. The weight of the moment lingered, pressing down on every guest, every staff member, every silent witness who had watched the situation unravel but had done nothing to stop it. But before Shaq could push open the glass doors, Lucille gently placed a hand on his arm. "Wait, baby," she said softly. Shaq turned to her, brow furrowed. "Mama, we don't have to stay here a second longer. Let's go." Lucille gave him a small, knowing smile. "I know, sweetheart, but just give me a moment." Shaq hesitated, then sighed and took a step back, letting his mother do what she always did best, turn pain into wisdom. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across the room, not with anger, not with resentment, but with a quiet strength that felt heavier than any shouted words. Her eyes landed on Victoria Lennox, who still stood behind the desk, shoulders stiff, hands clasped so tightly they trembled. Lucille exhaled, her voice gentle yet firm. "You know, I wasn't always someone who could walk into a place like this and expect to be treated with dignity." Victoria's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but she didn't respond. Lucille continued. "I grew up in a world where people like me weren't allowed in hotels like this. We weren't welcome in the lobbies, we weren't given a warm smile at the front desk, and we sure weren't invited to sit at the fancy tables." She let the words settle for a moment before adding, "And if we dared to step inside, we were reminded, quickly, that we didn't belong." A murmur rippled through the lobby. Some of the older guests shifted, nodding subtly, understanding exactly what she meant. Others, staff members, younger employees who had never lived through such times, looked almost uncomfortable, realizing that history wasn't as far away as they had believed. Lucille sighed, shaking her head slightly. You'd think after all these years, things would be different. And in some ways, they are. But in other ways, she glanced back at Victoria. Some people still look at me and decide, right then and there, who they think I am. Victoria swallowed, her jaw tightening. Lucille didn't raise her voice, but the weight of her words was undeniable. "I've been turned away from places before, told I wasn't welcome, told I was lesser." She let that hang in the air before adding, "But never, not once, did I let it make me bitter." The statement was gentle, but powerful. Lucille smiled slightly. "See, bitterness don't fix anything. It don't change people's hearts. Only grace can do that." A shift rippled through the room. The bellboy, Nathan, who had watched everything unfold from the sidelines, felt something tighten in his chest. Grace. How could she offer that after what had just happened? Daniel Foster, the assistant manager, exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He had spent so much time trying to control the situation, to minimize the damage, but now he felt it, the truth of it all settling deep. And Victoria. Victoria was unraveling. The shame she had been holding in, the tight grip she had kept on her pride was slipping through her fingers. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to tell herself that she had just been doing her job, that this had all been blown out of proportion. But as she looked into Lucille's eyes, kind, wise, steady, something inside her cracked. Lucille could have demanded her job, could have humiliated her the way she had humiliated Lucille. But instead, she stood here, offering her something far heavier, a lesson. Lucille took a step closer, her expression softening. "You made a mistake tonight, Miss Lennox. But mistakes are funny things. They can either define you, or they can change you." Victoria's throat bobbed. Lucille studied her for a moment, then said gently but firmly, "So tell me, which one is this going to be?" The room held its breath. Victoria, for the first time that night, had no answer. Her lip trembled slightly, and she exhaled shakily, as if fully realizing, the weight of her actions. A long silence stretched between them before, finally, Victoria gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I don't want to be that person, she whispered. Lucille smiled, small and warm. Then don't be. A stir moved through the room. Something shifting, something changing. And then, from the far side of the lobby, Daniel cleared his throat. As of tonight, he announced, his voice steady, the Regal Crown will be implementing mandatory sensitivity training for all employees, effective immediately. He looked at Shaq, then Lucille, before adding, and Mrs. O'Neill, if you'd be willing, I'd love to invite you back, to speak to our staff, to teach us. Lucille tilted her head, surprised. Shaq raised a brow. You serious? Daniel nodded. We need to do better, and it starts with listening. Lucille considered it for a moment, then chuckled softly. Well, now, I do like a good audience. Laughter rippled through the crowd, small but genuine. A tension that had been crushing just moments ago seemed to lift, replaced with something new. Hope. Lucille exhaled and looked at Victoria one last time. I'm gonna leave you with one piece of advice, sweetheart. Victoria nodded slowly, bracing herself. Next time someone walks through those doors, Lucille said, see them for who they are, not for who you assume them to be. Victoria blinked rapidly, nodding again, this time with more certainty. Lucille smiled. Good girl. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. That's my mama. And just like that, the moment shifted. Lucille turned back to her son, linking her arm through his. All right, baby. I think we've given these folks enough of a show. Let's go get some real hospitality somewhere else. Shaq grinned. Yes, ma'am. And as they finally stepped out into the night, the glass doors closing behind them, the weight of what had just happened settled over everyone left inside. It wasn't just a lesson. It was a turning point. Because some moments don't just change a night. They change people. And tonight, Lucille O'Neill had done just that. By the time Shaquille O'Neal and his mother stepped out into the cool night air, the world had already begun to take notice. The moment had seemed contained to the grand lobby of the Regal Crown Hotel, a confrontation witnessed only by those present. But in the digital age, nothing stays small. The whispers that had rippled through the guests had turned into quiet phone calls, into murmured retellings. And then, like a spark catching dry grass, it ignited. Someone had recorded the moment, not the chaos of an argument, not the rage of a celebrity demanding justice, but the quiet dismantling of bias. The video spread like wildfire. By morning, the footage was everywhere. Shaquille O'Neal defends his mother after luxury hotel denies her service. A lesson in respect, how Big Shaq handled a moment of discrimination without violence or outrage. Respect ain't got a dress code. Shaq's powerful words go viral. News outlets dissected the clip, praising Shaq's composure, Lucille's grace, and the uncomfortable truth the moment exposed. Talk shows debated it. Social media erupted with think pieces. Some defended the hotel, calling it a misunderstanding. Others argued that the moment represented something much larger than a single incident. It was a mirror reflecting society's still existing prejudices. One moment had turned into a movement. And yet, for Shaq and Lucille, life went on. They didn't bask in the attention. They didn't issue statements or give dramatic interviews. Lucille spent her days as she always had, with humility, faith, and the quiet power of someone who had seen the world change, but not nearly enough. Shaq continued his business, his philanthropy, his role as an ever-present force in sports and culture. But something had changed. Not for them, for the people watching. And what of Victoria Lennox? Her name never made it into the headlines. No articles shamed her. No public backlash demanded her resignation. But inside the walls of the Regal Crown, her presence became a question, not an answer. Some say she left, unable to bear the weight of what had happened, unable to face the training, the eyes of her colleagues, the shift in power. Others say she stayed, that the training forced her to confront herself in ways she never had before, that for the first time, she listened instead of dismissed. No one truly knows, but what mattered was that she would never forget. Months later, Shaq sat alone in a quiet hotel room, not the Regal Crown, but somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't hold memories of that night. The city lights flickered beyond the window, stretching endlessly. He leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone. The video had long faded from trending topics, replaced by new headlines, new moments, new controversies. But some things last beyond the news cycle. A direct message caught his eye. It was from a young bellboy at the Regal Crown. Nathan Carter. Mr. O'Neill, you probably don't remember me, but I was there that night. I wanted to say thank you. Not just for standing up for your mom, but for the way you did it. I've never seen someone handle something like that with so much control, so much power without needing to be loud. I've been thinking a lot since that night, about how many times I saw things that didn't sit right with me, but I stayed quiet because I was scared of losing my job. I don't want to be that kind of person anymore. I want to be someone who speaks up. You probably get messages like this all the time. But just know, that night changed something for me, and I won't forget it. Thank you. Shaq stared at the message for a long moment. Then, with a small, knowing smile, he typed back a simple response. Proud of you, man. Keep speaking up. The world needs more of that. He hit send. And just like that, the moment lived on. Because respect, it ain't got a dress code, and it never will. Some stories fade. This one leaves a mark. What would you have done in that moment? Looked away or spoken up? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because conversations like this, they change things. And if you think respect should never be a privilege, you're in the right place. Stay with us. There's more to uncover.